Welcome, everyone. Hi, my name is Nisha Baliga. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the co-executive director of Hester Street. Just bear with us for a few minutes. We're having some technical difficulties with one of our panelists who's sort of critical to the running of a session, so we're just trying to figure that out. And we will hopefully get started in a few minutes or have to sort of just figure out some stuff. So just bear with us, please. Thank you. Can you say something? Can you say hi?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Oh my God.
Hi. Okay.
Awesome. All right. Okay, that's great news. Go ahead,
I'll send
Jimena.
you the presentation.
Okay.
I'll just send you.
Okay, and then also the video, I guess. I'm not quite sure how to share that, but if we can't share it, we'll just figure it out. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Nisha Baliga. For those of you who just joined, I use she, hers pronouns, and I'm the co-executive director of Hester Street. Welcome to our session entitled Punitive to Proactive Code Enforcement, Housing and Community Health. Just so you know, we're a little bit sort of trying to pivot because we've had some technical issues, and I believe, Jimena, are you joining from your phone now? Because you're having problems with your laptop. Is that correct, Jimena? Yeah, I think there's a slight delay. Anyway, so just bear with us as we sort of try to figure that stuff out. So we're super excited to have this conversation about code enforcement with you. It's an often overlooked tool in creating safe, equitable, and affordable housing. I will be moderating the session and we'll be joined by Kate Lech, Senior Policy Analyst at Citizens Housing and Planning Council, and Jimena Veloz, Project Manager at Hester Street. And so the session will highlight the impacts of code enforcement on the health, safety, and well-being of renters, tenants, and residents in New York City and beyond. Redlining, disinvestment, and displacement have and continue to impact Black and Brown communities disproportionately. And these forces often intersect with code enforcement, where city agencies typically have played like a reactive role focused on using inequitable, punitive measures under the guise or goal of creating safe housing conditions. So we'll draw from examples from municipalities across the country to highlight challenges and discuss ways in which we can transform code enforcement systems to better address unsafe and unhealthy conditions while advancing key city services and social services and better engage residents and keep landlords accountable. Given the numerous housing challenges brought on by the pandemic, it's really critical that we evaluate and reimagine systems like code enforcement to advance healthier and more equitable communities. We know from our work that there's a sort of a really deep intersection between social justice and housing issues and code enforcement. But it's also a very wonky issue and technical, but it really does have a huge impact on housing and housing stock, housing conditions, the housing experience. Full disclosure, we are all sort of unabashed code enforcement nerds and would love to welcome more in the fold or like other people who are in that same sort of code enforcement sort of nerdiness, because we just feel like it is such an overlooked issue in this quest for more equitable and affordable cities. So the way we'll run the session, and just bear with us as we sort of like roll with the punches here, is we want to share first the story of Ms. Velez, just to give you a sense of the way code enforcement touches individuals. And then we want to talk a little bit about the possibilities of code enforcement, some case studies, and ideas for re-envisioning a more equitable code enforcement system in New York City and beyond. And we also want to leave some time for question and answers. Please feel free as you hear our presentations to add your comments and questions in the chat. When we get to the end of the session, we'll sort of we'll have a discussion, and we are really excited to hear. So with that, just bear with me as I sort of go to my email. I'm gonna go and try and see if I can play this video and awkwardly. Is there anything else? Or while I do that, I don't know, Kate and Jimena, you want to just quickly introduce?
Hi, I'm Kate Leach. I'm a senior policy analyst at CHPC. I'm happy to try and share the video if it's not working for you, Nisha.
Yes, please do. Please do, because I'm...
All right, bear with me, everyone. Okay, can you see that? Yes?
Now being told that the apartment basement for 50 years is now that the apartment is illegal, and she's facing thousands of dollars in fines and might even have to eliminate that apartment altogether. News 12's Marissa Marcelino has more on this Bronxites nightmare.
Mrs. Velez's story is just so emblematic of some of the challenges that low-income homeowners face in New York City. They're kind of the innocent victims of these arcane policies that came from a half a century.
89-year-old Mildred Velez purchased her house in Throgsneck in 1965, and a few years later had a contractor build a basement apartment. She's been renting it out for many years with no issues, until now.
I don't know why I have to be going through this. Never in my mind would I think that I had an illegal apartment, like they said, and a hazardous one.
It all started 2 years ago when someone filed a 311 complaint. That led DOB to inspect the property, and Velez says the Department of Buildings has been issuing her violations and fines ever since. They claim that when the apartment was built in the 1960s, there was no permit to do the work, and the seller was illegally converted.
If there's a safety issue, it's been that way for 50 years, and the fines and the constant summonses is compromising her housing stability and her health, frankly, but it's not doing anything to make anybody any safer.
The DOB says they've told Velez how to correct the violations by obtaining a permit for the construction that was done or revert the apartment back to its prior condition. However, Kat says they've hit a dead end.
Mrs. Velez is just in violation administratively with a variety of different rules. There is no way for her to solve it other than just to eliminate the apartment.
The DOB says Velez owes over $15,000 in fines for not correcting the illegal conditions. Kat says she wants the city to look into the regulations and to conduct an equity audit of enforcement strategies, because she says it's supposed to be about health and safety, and she doesn't think that's what's going on here. In Throgsneck, Marissa Marcelino, News 12 The Bronx.
Hopefully that gives you a sense of who some of the people grappling with DOB's labyrinthine system. That's the reality of who is trying to make their way through this process. I think Jimena was going to go and kick off our presentation if she's available.
Yeah, Jimena, the screen for you if you want to come back on. Hold on just a sec.
Thank you for bearing with us.
Yes, thank you so much. Oh, here comes Jimena. I'm going to try and share the screen while she sort of comes back on. If not, yeah, hold on. Thank you so much, everyone. Yes, we can put Emily. We can put the video to be in the chat. We'll put it in once we just get started. We'll definitely make sure you have it at the end. Okay, let's.
Can you hear me? Okay. Should I go ahead, Nisha? Or do you want to start us off?
No, go ahead. You see my screen, the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, here we go.
Yeah.
Just let me know when I need to advance.
Okay. Yeah. So first of all, sorry for all the technical difficulties. We checked in at 10 a.m. and everything worked fine. But anyway, so what we're here for today is basically in the past few years, Hester Street has had kind of like an amazing opportunity to work with 10 cities in upstate New York to take a look at where code enforcement and equity intersect. And today we're going to walk you through a little bit of what we've learned about enforcement in addressing housing conditions and kind of like ensuring that residents live in safe and healthy environments. And just to get us all in like the same page, Nisha, if you want to go to the first, the next slide.
Yep.
So just to get us all on the same page, I think just a quick primer on code enforcement, right? Every city has its rules and standards for housing, and kind of like all of these rules are geared towards making housing safer to live in and kind of like ensuring that it's healthy. And in many ways, the idea is that these rules are made to kind of like protect tenants and kind of like ensure that landlords keep their properties in good address vacant homes where they happen, and can like just in general have like healthy neighborhoods. And that's kind of like the possibility of code enforcement done right. Can you go to the next one?
Yep, I got it. Do you see it? Oh, do people hear me? Jimena, I think you're frozen, but the slide. Okay.
It's like everything has its in a way because they are. Oh no.
So, Jimena, I don't hear you very well, but I'll just quickly go over what you just talked about in this slide, which is, currently how code enforcement disproportionately impacts low-income community of colors. There's fear of eviction, immigration detention. People of color receive more violations in gentrifying neighborhoods. Low-income homeowners cannot often afford to address code violations, increasing foreclosure rates. So all of these homes that have housing vouchers are, housing voucher recipients are often placed in quality housing. So all of these kind of collectively disproportionately impact low-income communities of color.
Can you
Go
hear
ahead,
me now?
Jimena. Yes.
I'm
yes.
sorry about that. So basically, kind of like as I was saying, and as Nisha was just talking about, we kind of got trying to evaluate. If you go back to the previous slide, Nisha, kind of like how code enforcement is working today, and just like knowing that
enforcement, justice police, code enforcement, justice policing tends to concentrate on Black and brown neighborhoods, in part because like the housing conditions in Black and brown neighborhoods were allowed to deteriorate through redlining and disinvestment. And it kind of means that the burden of receiving violations, navigating like a convoluted process, paying fines, falls on low-income communities of color. And as I was saying, we've kind of started calling code inspectors the first responders of the built environment, because they are often kind of like directly on the ground, looking at all of these issues and responding to housing issues in a way that, to be fully honest, like us as planners don't necessarily do. Another thing that inspectors typically take a look at is ways in which, like, for example, like landlords refuse to report their properties and they end up like paying fines that don't address the issue. Or they can hire lawyers to navigate the process and retaliate against tenants. So there are issues like what Nisha was saying, right? Like the ones that we're seeing here in the screen, that we saw in like all of the cities that we were working in, right? Tenants afraid of contacting code enforcement because of fear of eviction or immigration detention, and gentrifying neighborhoods where people of color were receiving more violations, with like bias behind it. Housing voucher recipients who were placed in like low quality housing, and just in general, like low-income homeowners just not having money to afford, the code violations that they were getting. So like overall, what we learned is that code enforcement is often like really reactive. It responds to complaints and it's like punitive because it's focused on fines. And it's often focused on like the building condition itself without like really looking at like the social conditions around it that create it. And often inspectors are really trained, like they're coming from the contracting industry, they're like looking at building conditions, and they end up addressing issues that would be much better suited for a social worker. So if it sounds like this conversation is like really reminding you of the conversation we've been having this year about police, it really is no coincidence. If you go to the next one, Nisha. How we've been thinking about code enforcement and approaching code enforcement is thinking about it as a process and a system that is in the a process and system that is in a context of institutional and systemic racism, and it's reproducing those norms, and it's really impacting the populations that would benefit most from improving housing conditions. So if we go to the next one. So our work has been really focusing on how to make code enforcement more equitable, to really reframe what code enforcement means and how it is conducted by working both with city government, but also with communities, and getting them to work together to identify ways in which we can change how code enforcement works. So we go to the next one. So of course, right? What does it mean when we're talking about equitable code enforcement? I think you guys have probably seen this particular image so many times, and just like thinking, going beyond equality or treating everyone the same, thinking that the
Oh, did we lose Jimena again? Jimena, I think we just, there was just a gap. Okay. You just got cut off. Jimena? Hey folks, as you can imagine, we're just figuring this out. Just gonna give Jimena like 10 seconds to come back on.
Can you hear me, Nisha?
Yep. You
Okay.
just cut off. I don't know. We just were talking about equity, so we could go to the next slide probably. Just didn't, or whatever. I think you got cut off just when you were talking about the difference between equality and equity.
Yeah, I think just thinking about a little bit, sometimes when we think about enforcement of rules, we think about like one rule being applied the same to everyone and that leading to the same result. And we know that that is not necessarily what happens. So thinking more about kind of like equity in a way of like seeing what different populations needs and addressing those needs so that everyone can be healthy and safe, no matter where they are starting off. So if we go to the next slide, I think we have been working in, and we'll talk a little bit about it later after Kate talks about it. But what we've been working with cities is helping to identify the equity choice points, as we call them, and basically that is like aspects of the code enforcement process that really have an impact on equity. Figuring out where those are by kind of like mapping the processes and figuring out how different actors experience the same thing. So for example, when a code inspector comes to a house, he has some things that he is looking for. There are some ways that that interaction can work, but we also need to look at how the resident is experiencing that, and basically finding the ways to make the best adjustments so that the process is equitable overall. If we go to the next slide, Nisha. And basically, we landed on 5 big principles of how code enforcement can become more equitable. The first one is being restorative, basically like really recognizing and addressing the situations that got us to this moment of Black and Brown communities living in neighborhoods where disinvestment has happened, where redlining has happened, and that like really affect their housing conditions today. The second one is being evidence-based. I think in so many ways, when we think about code enforcement, we think of complaints, we think of like calling 311, but relying just on complaints is really no way for the city to make decisions about housing conditions. You know, biased information will get you biased results, and figuring out where all the streams of data that the city itself has that can tell us more about housing conditions, but more importantly, kind of like where are the risks of future bad conditions without relying on residents to make a call to 311 all the time. We are also thinking of equitable code enforcement as collaborative, right? Figuring out ways in which different agencies can collaborate to move the needle in ways that just inspecting houses can't do. So thinking about identifying housing conditions, addressing them, and supporting residents with social services as a way to kind of like make the interventions more holistic. We've also been thinking about being community-centric, right? Especially in this context where code enforcement disproportionately impacts communities of color, thinking about making sure that community voices really help shape the process and identify ways that the process can serve them better. And also thinking about the process being proactive, making sure that the cities are addressing issues before they become a huge problem, right? Like, why not address, for example, the houses that are at risk of becoming vacant instead of waiting until you get a complaint, a vacant house that is already creating issues for neighbors. So I'm gonna pause there and I'll pass it on to Kate so she can tell us a little bit more about how this plays out in New York City, and we'll kind of come back later and tell you a little bit of some cool examples of how we've worked with cities.
Thanks, Jimena. Good to see you back online. Hold on, I'm going to share my screen. Just give me 1 second. Okay, can everyone see that clearly? Thumbs up, Jimena? Yes, no?
Yes, I can see it.
Excellent. Thank you, Nisha. All right. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you to Hester Street for their amazing work on this topic. I'd like to take a few minutes to think about how New York City approaches enforcement and why it's important for us to scrutinize our practices through an explicit equity lens. So I just want to start by acknowledging that enforcement work is really hard and it's really important. Of course, there's no acknowledgement for our enforcement teams when things go right and people are safe, and there is a bright and unforgiving spotlight when things go wrong. New York City strives to keep the built environment safe for everyone, from someone renting a studio in a brownstone to a construction worker tethered to a high-rise under construction, and that's an enormous responsibility. This city holders and the primary tool we use to ensure that all of our residents and construction workers are safe in the built environment is the enforcement of New York City's construction, administrative, housing maintenance, and health codes. And as Jimena had mentioned, we like to think of the code enforcement officers as first responders to the built environment. So this is a schematic of New York City's enforcement system. Enforcement actions begin really in one of three ways: in response to a 311 complaint, during filings to initiate new work or renovations, or proactively, meaning they've already identified problematic buildings that they are going to visit. Just to give you a sense of scale, collectively, DOB and HPD responded to hundreds of thousands of 311 complaints last year. DOB reviewed a little over 100,000 job filings and made over 160,000 construction site inspections. And HPD's proactive program visits about 500 people annually. The boxes represent the three arms of our municipal government primarily responsible for enforcement. And we have DOB, which enforces the multiple dwelling law, our building codes, and the zoning resolution. HPD is responsible for the housing maintenance code, and the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene responds to health hazards like air quality and lead paint. Surprisingly, each of these arms report to different deputy mayors, and it makes sense that they would have different priorities and mandates. It's also unsurprising sometimes they can work at cross purposes. And the system is not just defined by legislation and building codes, but also by legal precedent, written procedures, data collection and management, agency norms, and individual incentives of all of the participants in the system. Just the scale and complexity of New York's enforcement system would warrant further scrutiny through an equity lens, we believe. So as Hester Street noted, enforcement has the power to do great things like revitalize neighborhoods and improve children's health outcomes and strengthen communities. But code enforcement, like any other government program or policy, can have unintended consequences. As I alluded to before, code enforcement can work against important housing policy goals, for example, thwarting the creation or preservation of affordable housing, destabilizing neighborhoods, and disproportionately penalizing New York's most vulnerable populations, like the elderly, like Mrs. Velez, low-income households, immigrant communities, and communities of color. I think it's really important to just underscore that our system advantages the powerful voices in a community, those with privilege and comfort and resources to navigate our government systems. This can result in the prioritizing of the demands of the people in power, which we've been seeing lately on the Upper West Side, weaponization of the enforcement system against neighbors, or neglect of neighborhoods with the greatest need. So biases underpinning a complaint-driven system like ours can be obvious. You can map 311 complaints across the city, and when you look at the hot spots, they don't necessarily align with areas of the city where you would expect the worst conditions of your housing stock. But identifying weaponization is more challenging. It's not as obvious, and you can't map it across the city. So here are two small examples of weaponization that have recently happened in New York City. On the top, that's a picture of a shelter in Queens that primarily serves elderly in the community. And the quote next to it is an excerpt from a 311 complaint that claimed work was being done by undocumented workers. I suspect that the caller was not checking on anyone's papers before calling 311. And just this tiny excerpt, reveals the underlying bias in the call. And the next example, some of you may have seen in The Gothamist, which reported on this. Following the New York City outbreak of the coronavirus, residents of Diker Heights and Bay Ridge began seeing these horrible flyers around the neighborhood claiming that these Chinese New Yorkers are destroying Bay Ridge with their illegal conversions and driving out the middle-class homeowners. CHPC has done extensive work on basement conversions, and we have seen firsthand that lodging a complaint against an alleged illegal conversion is a frequently used tactic to penalize your neighbor with additional government scrutiny. Repeated complaints can pose an inconvenience at best, and at worst, they can lead to financial losses, harassment, and even displacement. And frankly, that's a lot of power to put in the hands of anonymous callers. So circling back around to Mrs. Velez, who we met during the video, we think she represents a really kind of tangible example of how our code enforcement is impacting New Yorkers in everyday life. She's 89 years old, a widow in the Bronx, who has been issued with multiple violations because the contractor that she and her husband hired in 1969 to convert their basement didn't file the appropriate paperwork with DOB at the time. Since then, she's been renting out the unit, first to her ailing mother-in-law, then to a Section 8 tenant, and most recently to a retired government employee, never knowing until the 311 complaint was filed that this was an illegal unit. The current tenant is more like family to her. He checks on her, he buys her milk, he drives her to the bank. It's exactly the type of landlord-tenant relationship you would hope to see. So now, decades after the conversion, she's left with almost no options. So just to quickly summarize the problem, the house was built and sold as a one family with the option to convert the finished basement into a separate apartment. The realtor had pitched it to Mrs. Velez as a mother-daughter configuration. The homeowner hired a contractor to complete the apartment and had assumed, like most of us would, that the professional had done it according to the code. 50 years later, the anonymous caller complained, and the motives are anyone's guess. So it's been nearly 2 years now, as the video noted, and both the homeowner and tenant are still in housing limbo. In this 2-year period, the Department of Buildings continues to met out fines and violations, largely because it considers her a Class 1 immediately hazardous condition because she has a gas stove in the unit. So it's been there 50 years. So what would it take her to comply? There are two paths. One, evict the tenant and restore the basement to its pre-1969 condition. Or two, file an application to verify that the work done in 1969 was done according to the code in effect at the time. But here's the thing. The timing of the violation, which was, I believe, December 2018, makes it essentially impossible for her to retain the unit. The neighborhood was actually downzoned in 2004, rendering it impossible for a fully attached unit to have a second dwelling unit added. So if she were to pursue that option, in addition to your architect, the contractor, maybe an expediter, she would have to hire a zoning and land use lawyer to file a long shot zoning determination request. And that's an option that she can't afford. I mean, an 89-year-old woman is trying to navigate now Zoom hearings. The idea of having to hire a zoning and land use lawyer for something that's been there 50 years is really not within her capacity. So all of this, of course, is done in the name of safety, but I would argue that neither the public, her neighbors, Mrs. Velez, or her tenant are any safer as a result of this enforcement action. So in this case, our enforcement system is working at cross purposes with our housing policies, and that's because compliance is not a policy. Compliance is not a policy goal in and of itself. Safe housing for New Yorkers would be a housing goal, a housing policy, but that's not what we're enforcing. So let's take a minute to just think about Mrs. Velez's case through not compliance, what laws she does and doesn't meet, but through the housing policy objectives and the health policy objectives that we're trying to attain. So safety, chief among all of the housing goals. While her basement apartment is structurally safe and habitable, the city is correct. There are no files that assure anyone that all of the plumbing, including the stove, were installed correctly and according to the code at the time. But that's fair. But in terms of creation and preservation of affordable units, which has been the cornerstone of New York City housing policy for ages, ultimately Mrs. Velez will have to dismantle and vacate the unit, which has long provided a one-bedroom that's been affordable to households around 40 to 50% of AMI. And that was created in the private market without government subsidy. And that's a real loss to the city that's in an affordable housing crisis. Housing stability. The tenant will lose his home. He's been there more than 15 years. And ultimately, Mrs. Velez is likely to have a lien put on her house because she can't afford to pay the mounting fines. And ultimately, both occupants could end up homeless. And that's when helping elderly age in place is actually a direct initiative of HPD. Our 89-year-old homeowner on a fixed income would have to go into debt to retain an architect and a contractor to pay the construction costs, to pay the filing fees and the fines in order just to retain the unit or resolve her violations. The loss of her tenant alone makes her more isolated, physically and financially vulnerable. So aging in place for her really isn't an option. Oops, let me go back for a second. And lastly, on this list, at least, as housers, we would like to strengthen and stabilize neighborhoods. Code enforcement can empower residents. It can address neighborhood blight. If you remember the video from and the photo from a few slides ago, you can tell that her house is not in disrepair. Unsanitary and unsafe conditions are not an issue here. She has, meticulous garden beds and little plants, and the recycling and garbage are all well maintained. So it's not really an issue. And Mrs. Velez will tell you that she is a longtime resident of the block. She was a newlywed when she moved there. And many of her neighbors are also longtime residents of that block. And if you listen to some of them, they say that overly punitive enforcement actions have actually driven a number of their former neighbors out of the neighborhood, which is a real shame for this community. So making a quick turn to health goals. Housing and health are inextricably linked. We know this. COVID has brought that into clear focus for us. Housing provides a safe space, access to basic needs and hygiene. Enforcement of housing laws can protect communities from unsanitary conditions. It can make sure that children aren't exposed to lead and other pollutants that cause chronic health conditions. And it can improve health equity by allocating government resources to communities with the most need and that have suffered from decades of disinvestment. It can also improve housing security and affordable housing preservation. Housing affordability impacts whether households can afford to pay their rent and pay for medical care. So housing affordability is a major determinant of health. And housing is also a tool to thwart the spread of infectious disease. New York City's code enforcement bodies have their origins in public health. The Tenement Act of 1901 established a Bureau of Inspection, which ultimately evolved into the enforcement apparatus we have today. Just a plug for CHPZ's archives, we have amazing records of the reports from the city's first housing inspectors, and they're amazing. And if I had more time, I would probably read you some excerpts, but I recommend that you visit our archive. Anyway, the point of the act was to improve the health and safety of tenements, which were considered a source of infectious disease. People were worried about the spread of smallpox and tuberculosis. So in the COVID era, we really have to remember housing's public health roots. Access to affordable and safe and sanitary housing is paramount. You can't shelter in place during COVID when you don't have shelter. Living in substandard conditions forces an occupant to decide whether he or she should be exposed to a deadly disease or sequester in conditions that exacerbate chronic health conditions. Overcrowding is a major factor in the transmission of an infectious disease. Our enforcement should ultimately aim to retain units and make sure that those that are retained are safe and habitable. So what would an equitable solution look like with regard to Ms. Velez? Well, it would consider her capacity to resolve the violations, the public safety risk, and the policy objectives at play. To resolve the violations rather than just punish them, it would take a different approach than what we have. For example, incentives that would work to make the Jared Kushners of the world bring their house or their units up to code are not going to be the same tools that would effectively help Mrs. Velez bring her house up to code. There has to be acknowledgement of the different capacity. Ultimately, the city would strengthen relationship with the community and retain the units. The city could have deployed an inspector to ensure that the stove and the plumbing were up to code immediately. They could have connected her to a caseworker. They could have put her in touch with the SHAP program to help her finance the repairs. Instead, the underlying violations remain open, and it's taken a real toll, as our executive director noted in the video, on her health and well-being. So we have a vision for equitable enforcement. Reframe enforcement so it's proactive and goal-oriented, strategically deploy equitable resources equitably, and create tools to resolve violations and not just punish them. And I am going to turn it over to Nisha and Jimena again so they can give you a little inspiration for what that might look like.
Thanks so much, Kate. We wanted to sort of talk a little bit about some exciting kind of case studies of things that different cities are doing, really responding to the human-centric aspect of code enforcement. And Jimena is going to just share a couple of examples for 5 minutes so that we have, we're running a little behind, but we still have some time for Q&A. And it's been nice to see the chat also popping up with questions and answers there. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jimena to talk about a few case studies from the work we did at in Cities Rise.
Sure. So just super quickly, I mentioned before that we work with 10 cities in upstate New York. And this was part of like a larger program with Attorney General's office. And I'm happy to tell you more about it later. And we also have a full report that you can read. So I'll jump through a few things. But basically, a lot of the work we did with all of these cities is very similar to what Kate was talking about, need to do in New York. So what we did is help each city understand their code process and what were their equity points by like doing in-depth interviews with agencies and staff, workshops with stakeholders, riding along with inspectors to see how they did their job, and meeting with community organizations. We basically put together like a process map for cities to figure out what were in each part of the process their pain points, their opportunities, and like even the best practices, because some of them were doing really cool stuff already. And one thing that we really wanted to do too was to not only talk to staff to identify the pain points, but also work with community. And we helped them and we created a lot of materials for them so that they could engage community around code enforcement, which is, as Tanisha said at the start, like a really like wonky technical issue, but that really has an effect on people's lives. So just a few spotlights of how cities decided to do this, kind of like bringing community to identify pain points. So for example, in Rochester, they did like small meetings with trusted partners to address issues with refugee communities. They were pretty sensitive to like cultural norms. They really connected residents to city resources and then established such just ongoing dialogue so that it was not like a one-time thing when the code enforcement team was reaching out to community. Myra, it's like a small town in upstate New York, but they really worked really hard to build trust with community organizations, to leverage partnerships to reach the populations that just wouldn't call code enforcement on the phone. And they really went out and did like tabling at community events, focus groups, home repair, cleanup days. They really went deep to gather information from their community about what was really happening and what were the things that they really wanted to see different. So a lot of the cities ended up with fantastic plans about the future. And here's just a taste of them. Just to see how broad the idea of equitable code enforcement can be. Some cities went like deep to be like, our community doesn't know yet what healthy housing and code enforcement looks like. So they went deep and did like education materials, both for tenants and homeowners. They also did training. They realized that their staff wasn't necessarily, they didn't necessarily have the tools to do their job right, because they were suddenly acting as social workers. So they did, some cities decided to do mental health first aid, conflict resolution for code officers so they could do their job better. Other cities decide to go deep on community engagement, go and have like regular meetings, make data accessible, put kiosks in city hall, and also like do outreach to the community when code positions were available, so that code enforcement could come from the community. Other cities decided to create completely new staff roles to have community ambassadors, caseworkers, eviction prevention counselors to basically get to people before it became a huge problem. Other people decided to really invest in partnerships, like fund community organizations and collaborate with legal aid services to help tenants through the whole process. And other cities decided to directly support residents through loan funds, displacement funds, to make sure that the impacts of code enforcement activity didn't really impact people's pockets. And in the end, some other cities just decided to directly invest, give funds to abate like really dangerous or unhealthy issues, put money towards community cleanups, put money towards kind of like dilapidated homes, and also emergency housing for displaced tenants, like for example, in places where there were big issues of housing being in terrible conditions and that creating displacement. So just this is just like a big taste of what we work with cities on. There are also fantastic examples of other places around the country that have done, for example, one of our favorites is Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, that did bias training for code officers to make sure that they had some they had ways to respond to bias complaints. The other cities, for example, Los Angeles just made just got rid of anonymous 311 calls as a way to make sure that complaints aren't biased. And we've also heard about Boston having like a really interesting like triage model for when hoarding becomes an issue, and how to kind of really address this as a comprehensive issue instead of just like a code issue. So I'm gonna leave it there. So that we can have time for questions.
Thanks for that, Jimena. I think what we wanted to do is the work with Hester Street and CHPC had been doing on equitable code enforcement. We had a couple of really quick wish list items that we wanted for New York City. So we're just going to put that in there, and then would love to just open it up while Kate ends it on question and answers, reactions. It's been really great to see the chat. And just get your impressions and ideas on how we can increase information and knowledge about like code enforcement. So I'll just hand it over to Kate, and then we'll go to Q&A.
CHPC and Hester Street are hoping to engage with the city on what we are thinking of as an equity audit. So that's a comprehensive look at our entire enforcement framework, mapping what those processes look like, doing in-depth interviews with all of the stakeholders and constituents, having it be community-centric, of course, but interviews were, as Jimena noted, critical to their work with Cities Rise. So ride-alongs with code inspectors, we imagine would be really eye-opening, informative. We would love to scrutinize the data collection. That's a huge problem. There was a wonderful study in 2016 by Legevy and Schaefer that looked at 311 complaints across New York City that found that the quote fuzzy boundaries between more homogenous ethno-racial enclaves had disproportionately more 311 complaints with regard to their neighbors than more homogenous or totally diverse communities. So that was really interesting. So I think it warrants scrutiny of how we collect our data. And we would love to generate potential recommendations for a pilot based on this assessment, these interviews, community engagement, and we would love to work with all of you on that.
Thanks so much for that, Kate. It's fun to sort of hear the chat. I feel like we're in fellow company of other code enforcement nerds here. And we also have representation from Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, which is exciting. I'm going to go to one of the questions that came in through the chat from Elliot. Do you think reshaping or improving 311 should be part of equitable code enforcement? And what can be done to combat the bias in terms of who's making 311 calls and where and how those calls are responded to? Yes, I know you.
We'll jump in. Yes. I believe the city of Los Angeles changed their system so that 311 complaints can no longer be anonymous. I believe the names aren't released to the public, but they are available to the agencies involved. And my understanding is that Los Angeles has also tried to move away from a complaint-driven system. So they're doing more proactive inspections on a cyclical basis, and that's in conjunction with their rental registration program. So I do think there's an opportunity that's a very kind of like easy lift for the city in terms of 311. And I don't know if you've heard of Nextdoor, which is an app. where neighbors can report on neighborhood conditions, and it's been rife with kind of reporting on neighbors unnecessarily, a lot of racial undertones. And to address that problem, the app actually created this moment where before you file a complaint or post about someone in your neighborhood, it asks you explicitly whether there's anything concerning other than race. So they've seen this huge kind of decline in those types of comments in their system. Not that it's perfect, but I think just slowing down the process and making people kind of confront that potential bias is a step in the right direction. There might be an opportunity there for the city. Of course, New York is a giant, diverse city, and modifying our systems is a slow process. So.
Thanks for that, Kate. Jimena, is there anything on that question that you want to add? Oh, Jimena says that she can't hear Kate, so it's hard for her to know what Kate said. But if there's just anything you want to add to the question around 311 complaints, Jimena.
Yeah, I think.
Oh.
Can you hear me? Okay. I think also just thinking about, just thinking about 311 not being the only way. And I don't know how repetitive that is of what Kate said, but moving from a system where complaints are the main issue that inspectors are looking at, and just making it so that we're not relying on people calling in, so that the city knows about housing issues, housing conditions, and that can be done through like rental registration and other ways that cities are doing it.
Cool, thank you so much. I just want to shout out Jimena, who's been, really giving some amazing, coherent, data-driven lecture and all of these things while she's sort of had a lot of tech issues. So thanks, Jimena. I know it's been rough. Okay, so Lacey asks, how does LA deal with potential retaliation harassment by landlords of tenants who report? Do we know that, Kate? That's a good thing to think about, I guess. That's something for all of us to sort of be like, what are the unintended consequences of the report? And then Emily asks, beyond this, might be beyond the scope here, but what's on your wish list for how the city law department brings code enforcement lawsuits? Are there any recommendations to improve equity of those actions? Kate, do you have any? Kate, you want to?
Sure. I don't know if this will address that question directly, but for example, the oath hearings that many people experience when they have to fight a parking ticket, that's also the same kind of mechanism that a lot of our code enforcement complaints go through. And they ask you whether you want legal representation, but it feels like you're at the DMV, so you end up going without your representation, but DOB has a legal representative there. So I think the system is flawed, and it's very kind of asymmetrical in terms of the power in that situation, and there's certainly room for improvement there. I don't know if that addresses your question.
Thanks, Kate. Jimena, is there anything you want to add to the law question? Oh, I think you're on mute.
So many times with so many of our partners, one of the things that we always heard is that when a case makes it to the law department or the courts, it tends, for example, say a landlord will rather pay a fine, like go to court, get a fine from the court, and then pay that fine, and then not address the issue. I think in a lot of cities that we were working with, their whole mission was to not get there, to make sure to work with homeowners, to work with landlords to address issues so that it didn't have to go to court. But of course, there were still a lot of cases where that was the case, and a lot of the cities were also thinking about having just like a tighter grasp of what happened on the court side, because sometimes a case would go through court several times and then get back on their lap, and they couldn't necessarily and they didn't necessarily do follow-up. And that's some of our partners, just because they didn't have the capacity to do that follow-up with courts.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a good point on how do you prevent court from being the action there. So unfortunately, we are at 2:45, and I believe that is the end of our session. I want to thank the panelists who sort of pivoted with a lot of last-minute stress to share this information. I want to thank Nicole, who's been a volunteer, sort of troubleshooting us and supporting us here, and then all of you for sort of being patient and then just having this really active chat. I think we leave this conversation feeling less alone in our excitement and our sort of like the power and the sort of potential of code enforcement for being another tool to advance equitable housing and affordable housing in New York City and beyond. So thank you all. I hope that we can be in touch, and I hope that you find the resources that we shared helpful and useful, and we hope to be with you all to discuss code enforcement again many times. Thank you all.